My name is Caroline. I am 33 years old, and I own an upscale catering and event planning company. I went home smiling to surprise my parents with the biggest news of my career. But when I pushed open the front door, the silence was deafening. There they were, lying perfectly still on the hardwood floor, foaming at the mouth. The doctors later told me they were poisoned. But what my husband discovered a week later made my entire body tremble. Before I share the nightmare that destroyed my family, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever fought for the truth when everyone else was lying. For years, I had been chasing the impossible goal of making my parents, Thomas and Catherine, truly proud of me. Growing up in a wealthy suburban neighborhood outside of Chicago, success was measured in highly specific, traditional metrics. You were either a doctor, a corporate lawyer, or a tech visionary like my brother Bradley. When I chose to pursue culinary arts and hospitality, my parents treated my career like a cute, temporary hobby. They never missed an opportunity to tell their country club friends that I was just baking cupcakes for a living. They deliberately ignored the fact that my company had grown into a premier luxury catering service, managing high-profile corporate galas and elite weddings across the city. I worked 80-hour weeks, built a massive commercial kitchen, and managed a team of 40 dedicated employees. Yet every Sunday dinner ended with a subtle jab from my father about when I was going to find a real profession. But today was supposed to be the day that changed everything. After months of grueling presentations and tasting menus, I had just signed a massive multi-year contract with one of the largest tech conglomerates in the state to cater all their corporate events. It was a deal worth millions. It was undeniable proof that my business was an absolute triumph. I was so overjoyed that I went straight to my commercial kitchen and baked my parents' absolute favorite dessert. I made artisan lemon blackberry tarts with a toasted meringue topping. I carefully packaged them in a pristine white bakery box tied with a silk ribbon. I drove toward their upscale neighborhood with a heart full of hope. I kept picturing the look of genuine respect on my father's face and the warm, validating hug I might finally get from my mother. The afternoon sun cast long, golden shadows across their perfectly manicured lawn as I pulled into the wide driveway. Their house, a massive stone colonial, stood quiet and imposing against the autumn sky. I grabbed the bakery box from the passenger seat, feeling a flutter of nervous excitement in my stomach. I walked up the brick pathway, balancing the box on one arm as I reached for the spare key on my keychain. Usually when I visited, I could hear the faint sound of classical music drifting from the living room or the low murmur of the television news. But as I turned the key and pushed the heavy oak door open, the silence that greeted me was absolute. It was a thick, heavy quiet that immediately made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up in alarm. I stepped into the grand foyer and closed the door behind me. I called out a cheerful hello, expecting to hear my mother's footsteps approaching from the kitchen. There was no answer. I took off my coat and hung it on the rack. That was when the scent hit me. It completely overpowered the fresh, zesty aroma of the lemon tarts in my hands. The smell hanging in the air of my parents' home was thick, cloying, and intensely artificial. It smelled fiercely of bitter almonds mixed with a sickeningly sweet chemical syrup. The odor was so intense it coated the back of my throat and made my eyes water. I called out for them again, my voice wavering with a sudden, inexplicable sense of deep dread. I walked past the dining room and turned the corner into the main living room. The bakery box slipped from my hands, crashing onto the pristine hardwood floor. The lemon tarts shattered, splattering bright purple blackberry juice across the pale wood boards. Thomas and Catherine were sprawled awkwardly on the expensive Persian rug. Their skin was a terrifying ashen shade of gray, tinged with a sickly blue around their lips. Thick white foam bubbled violently from the corners of their mouths, trailing down their chins and staining their clothes. Their eyes were rolled back in their heads, and their bodies were completely rigid. My father's pill bottle for his heart medication was knocked over on the glass coffee table. white tablets scattered everywhere like tiny pieces of hail. But the horrific, sweet chemical smell in the air told me instantly that this was no ordinary heart attack. I dropped to my knees, my mind fracturing into a million pieces of sheer panic. I grabbed my phone from my pocket and dialed emergency services, screaming at the dispatcher to send an ambulance immediately. The operator instructed me to check their breathing and begin chest compressions. I scrambled over to my father, placing the heel of my hand on his chest and pushing down with all my weight. I heard the awful, sickening sound of his ribs cracking under the force, but I did not stop. I pumped my arms up and down, tears blinding my vision, sobbing and pleading with them to wake up. With every compression, that overpowering toxic smell of bitter almonds pushed out of his lungs and hit my face. My arms burned with exhaustion, but I kept going, moving frantically between my mother and my father, desperately trying to force life back into their still bodies. It felt like an endless nightmare. I refused to let them die. The wail of the ambulance sirens shattered the quiet suburban afternoon, tearing me away from the living room floor where I had been fighting to keep my parents alive. Paramedics swarmed the house, pushing me aside as they loaded Thomas and Catherine onto stretchers. I rode in the back of the ambulance, my hands covered in the sticky, sweet-smelling residue that had coated my father's mouth. The bright fluorescent lights of the emergency room blinded me as we burst through the sliding glass doors. Nurses and doctors shouted medical jargon, rushing my parents into trauma bays, while a stern triage nurse directed me to the intensive care waiting area. I paced the sterile linoleum floor for what felt like hours. I dialed my husband, David, my hands shaking so violently I could barely hold the phone to my ear. I blurted out that my parents were dying and begged him to meet me at the hospital. He promised he was already on his way, his calm, analytical voice offering the only anchor I had in that chaotic storm. After hanging up, I stared at my reflection in the dark hospital window. My clothes were stained with juice from the dropped tarts, mixed with the terrifying reality of what I had just witnessed. Finally, a lead toxicologist stepped through the swinging double doors. His face was grim, his clipboard clutched tightly to his chest. He asked me to sit down, but I refused, demanding to know what kind of massive heart attack caused that horrific chemical smell in their home. He looked me in the eye and delivered the first crushing blow of the night. It was not a cardiac event. The rapid toxicology screen came back positive for massive amounts of ethylene glycol, antifreeze. He explained that the chemical has a distinctly sweet taste and a heavy, syrupy consistency. That sweetness masked its deadly nature when mixed into a beverage. Someone had intentionally poisoned them. The substance was currently crystallizing in their kidneys, shutting down their major organs one by one. They were both intubated, comatose, and fighting for their lives on dialysis machines. The word poisoned echoed in my skull, ringing so loudly it drowned out the steady hum of the hospital intercoms. My brain struggled to process the sheer malice required to feed antifreeze to two elderly people. Who would want to murder Thomas and Catherine? They were wealthy, privileged suburbanites who spent their days managing their investment portfolios and playing tennis. Just as the toxicologist turned to leave, the heavy waiting room doors flew open. My younger brother, Bradley, stormed into the intensive care unit. He was dressed in his usual expensive startup uniform, a tailored blazer over a crisp designer t-shirt, projecting the flawless image of a wildly successful tech entrepreneur. The golden child had arrived. Close behind him was his wife, Nia. She was a brilliant African-American woman who worked as an emergency room nurse at a different trauma center across the city. Her medical instincts were already on high alert, her keen eyes scanning the chaotic trauma bays and reading the heavy tension in the room. I stepped forward, ready to collapse into my brother's arms, desperate for any shred of familial comfort in this waking nightmare. I fully expected him to ask if they were breathing, if they were conscious, or what the doctors were doing to save their lives. Instead, he completely ignored my tear-stained face. He brushed right past me, as if I were totally invisible, and marched straight to the head nurse at the central desk. Bradley slammed his hands down on the high counter, demanding the nurse attention. He did not ask about their vital signs. He did not ask about their prognosis. His voice was frantic, laced with a very specific, greedy kind of panic that made my blood run completely cold. "Did they sign the trust fund transfer documents this morning?" he demanded, his eyes darting wildly across the nurse's station. "I sent the legal courier to their house at exactly 9. I need to know if the paperwork was officially finalized before they collapsed. Please tell me the contracts were signed." I stood paralyzed behind him, watching his shoulders heave with desperate anticipation. He showed absolutely no empathy, no grief, and no fear for their well-being, just an obsessive fixation on money. The sheer audacity of his words hit me like a physical punch to the gut. My parents were dying on ventilators a few feet away, their bodies aggressively shutting down from industrial poison, and my brother was agonizing over estate transfers and legal signatures. I was completely sickened. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the reception desk. The head nurse stared at him in utter disbelief. I looked over at Nia. As an experienced trauma nurse, she immediately caught the horrific anomaly of his behavior. Normal families beg for miracles. They cry. They ask about antidotes and survival rates. Nia froze in her tracks, her sharp gaze shifting from her husband, erratic, sweating profile to my horrified expression. We locked eyes across the stark waiting room. In that single, silent exchange, the horrifying reality of the situation solidified between us. Nia knew exactly what ethylene glycol poisoning entailed, and she recognized the profound guilt radiating from her husband's pores. The golden child was not mourning the impending loss of his parents. He was calculating his financial payout. He was calculating the exact timeline of his inheritance. My brother did not care if they lived or died. He only cared if the ink was dry on the paper before their hearts stopped beating. My hands clenched into fists at my sides. The sweet chemical scent of the poison still lingered on my skin, and as I watched Bradley badger the hospital staff about his trust fund, a terrifying realization washed over me. The monster who poisoned my parents was standing right in front of me, calculating his wealth. Before I could confront my brother about his sickening priorities, the heavy double doors of the intensive care unit swung open again. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a rumpled gray suit strode into the waiting room. His badge hung from a chain around his neck, catching the harsh, fluorescent light. He introduced himself as Detective Ramirez. His voice was deep and authoritative, instantly cutting through the chaotic noise of the hospital. He did not offer any warm condolences or gentle sympathies. He carried a leather-bound notepad and a pen, his dark eyes scanning the room with sharp, calculating precision. He announced that the hospital had officially contacted the police department. The presence of industrial antifreeze in my parents' blood was no longer just a medical emergency. It was now an active, open criminal investigation for attempted double homicide. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Attempted double homicide. I felt my knees buckle slightly, the reality of the situation crashing down on me all over again. Someone had deliberately tried to murder my mother and father. But as I leaned against the cold vinyl of the waiting room chair for support, I watched my brother Bradley react to the detective announcement. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. The greedy, impatient tech entrepreneur vanished. In his place, a cornered, desperate animal emerged. Bradley's face drained of all color. The smug entitlement evaporated, replaced by a frantic, sweating panic. He looked at Detective Ramirez, then at the intensive care unit doors, and finally, his wild eyes locked onto me. I could physically see the gears turning in his head. He needed a scapegoat, and he needed one right now. Before Detective Ramirez could even ask his first preliminary question, Bradley lunged forward. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at my face. His voice echoed through the crowded waiting area, loud and piercing, designed to draw the attention of every nurse, doctor, and bystander in the vicinity. "She did it!" Bradley screamed, his face contorting into a mask of fabricated rage and grief. "My sister did it! She is the one who poisoned them!" I gasped, the air rushing out of my lungs as if I had been physically struck. "Bradley, what are you talking about?" I pleaded, taking a step toward him. "I just performed CPR on Dad. I tried to save them." "Do not play the innocent victim," he yelled, stepping closer to the detective and positioning himself as the protective son. "She brought food over to their house today. She baked these artisan lemon tarts. She has a massive commercial catering kitchen with access to all sorts of industrial chemicals and supplies. She baked those tarts, spiked them with poison, and hand-delivered them to our parents." Detective Ramirez immediately turned his piercing gaze toward me. His pen hovered over his notepad. "Ma'am, did you bring baked goods to the residence today?" he asked, his tone shifting from informative to interrogative. "Yes, but I would never hurt them," I stammered, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. "I went over there to celebrate a business contract. I dropped the box when I found them unconscious on the floor. I called 911. Bradley let out a harsh, theatrical laugh. It sounded so forced, yet so dripping with venom. "Celebrate? You were not celebrating anything. You were furious. You went over there to enact revenge." He turned fully toward Detective Ramirez, commanding the narrative with the slick, persuasive charm he usually reserved for venture capitalists. "My sister has been insanely jealous of me her entire life. She resents my success. She resents the fact that our parents are incredibly proud of my technology company. But the real motive is the estate." Bradley paused dramatically, making sure the entire waiting room was hanging on his every word. Nia stood behind him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her dark eyes wide with disbelief as she watched her husband weave this monstrous web of lies. "Our parents called a family meeting last week," Bradley continued, his voice dripping with fake sorrow. "They announced they were restructuring their estate planning. They realized my sister catering business was a financial black hole. They decided to leave the family estate, the primary house, the investment portfolios, and the trust funds entirely to me. They were officially cutting her out of the primary inheritance. They wanted to protect their wealth." Caroline was enraged. She screamed at them, she threatened them. She realized the paperwork was being finalized this very morning, and she knew she had to stop them from signing those transfer documents. "That is a complete lie," I shouted, my voice cracking under the sheer weight of his betrayal. "There was no family meeting. I never threatened them. You are making all of this up." "She is lying to save herself, Detective," Bradley insisted, taking a step toward the officer. "She knew exactly what she was doing. She brought those poisoned tarts to kill them before the lawyers could file the new trust documents. She wanted to inherit her half of the money before they could officially disinherit her. Ask the paramedics. Ask the nurses. She was the only one at the house. She had the means, she had the motive, and she had the opportunity." The sheer audacity of his fabrication paralyzed me. He was weaponizing the very transfer documents he had just been demanding the nurses about. He was flipping his own greedy, murderous motive and projecting it entirely onto me. He was painting me as the bitter, jealous, financially desperate daughter, willing to commit patricide for a paycheck. And the most terrifying part was how convincing he sounded. He had always been the golden child, the charismatic son, who could do no wrong in our parents' eyes. Now, he was using that exact same manipulative charm to frame me for their murder. Detective Ramirez flipped to a fresh page in his notepad. His expression remained neutral, revealing nothing. Detective Ramirez looked up from his notepad, his eyes locking onto mine with an unreadable, stony gaze. He asked me if I had any financial disputes with my parents regarding the estate. The sheer injustice of the question made my blood roar. I stepped toward Bradley, no longer a terrified sister, but a woman pushed to the edge. I told the detective that my brother was spinning a pathetic, desperate lie to cover his own tracks. I yelled that I never cared about inheriting their estate because I had already bought and paid for that house with my own blood and broken bones. Bradley tried to interrupt, opening his mouth to shout me down, but I raised my voice louder, demanding that the detective hear the actual truth about our family finances. I laid it out right there. When I was 18 years old, a distracted driver ran a red light and crushed my compact car. I spent 4 agonizing months in physical therapy, learning how to walk without wincing. The insurance paid out a settlement of $300,000 for my pain, suffering, and permanent nerve damage. It was my college fund and safety net. Instead, my parents sat me at the kitchen table, weeping and claiming they were drowning in underwater mortgages. They begged me to sign the settlement over to them, insisting it was the only way to save our childhood home from foreclosure. They promised to pay me back every single cent. They manipulated a traumatized teenager into handing over her entire future to protect the family. I pointed a shaking finger at Bradley, who shifted uncomfortably under the harsh hospital lights. I told Detective Ramirez that the moment the bank cleared my settlement check and paid off their mortgage, my parents completely suffered from a convenient case of amnesia. They never paid back a dime. Worse, when Bradley launched his first startup, my parents proudly announced at Thanksgiving that the family estate would be left entirely to him. They claimed it was to give their brilliant son a solid foundation for his tech empire. They took my pain, my settlement, and my sacrifice, and gift-wrapped it for the golden child. I looked the detective dead in the eye and stated clearly that I did not need their trust fund. I built a multi-million-dollar luxury catering company completely from scratch, without a single dollar of their support. I told Ramirez to look at Bradley, to look at the sweat dripping down his forehead and the frantic twitch in his jaw. Bradley was the one living above his means. Bradley was the one who drove a $100,000 sports car while supposedly running a startup that no one had ever actually seen turn a profit. I demanded that the police look into his bank accounts, not mine. I screamed that he was the only person desperate enough for cash to feed industrial chemicals to the parents who worshipped him. Bradley immediately lunged into defense mode, adopting a tone of exaggerated, condescending pity. He held his hands up in a placating gesture, telling the detective that my outburst was exactly what he meant. He claimed I was hysterical and obsessed with a decades-old insurance payout that our parents had rightfully used for medical bills. He lied through his teeth, stating that my catering business was a chaotic mess and that I was drowning in commercial debt. He spun a narrative that I was a bitter, resentful woman who could not let go of the past, making me sound like a textbook suspect for a crime of passion. I turned to look at his wife, Nia. She stood perfectly still, her sharp nursing instincts taking in every micro-expression on her husband's face. She knew him better than anyone. She knew his startup was failing. She knew about the late-night phone calls and the unexplained missing money from their joint accounts. Nia did not say a word to defend him. She did not step forward to hold his hand or offer a unified front. She simply stared at Bradley with a cold, terrifying realization dawning in her dark eyes. She was an African-American woman who worked her way through grueling ER shifts to build a respectable life, and she was currently watching the man she married unravel into a cornered suspect. Her silence spoke volumes, and Bradley knew it. Before I could urge Nia to speak up, a sharp ringing sound cut through the heavy tension. Detective Ramirez pulled a standard-issue smartphone from his suit pocket. He held up a hand, silencing the waiting room, and stepped a few feet away to take the call. The hospital intercom hummed softly as we waited in agonizing suspense. Bradley paced like a caged animal. I stood completely frozen, praying my amazing husband David would finally burst through the hospital doors and wake me up from this nightmare. Ramirez ended the call and walked very slowly back to us. His face was a mask of absolute authority. He looked directly at me, his voice totally devoid of any warmth. He announced that based on my brother's statement and the physical evidence of the shattered bakery box at the crime scene, a judge had just fast-tracked a search warrant. The police were currently raiding my commercial catering kitchen. Hazmat teams and forensic units were tearing through my freezers, confiscating my ingredients, and seizing my computers to search for traces of ethylene glycol. Ramirez stated that the city health department had been notified, and my business license was suspended indefinitely pending the attempted murder investigation. I felt the floor drop out from under me. My life work, The multi-million-dollar contract I had just signed, the 40 employees relying on me for their paychecks, it was all gone in an instant. Bradley had not just framed me for murder. He had successfully destroyed my entire livelihood, leaving me defenseless while he stood there smirking. I stared at that smirk, a chilling curvature of his lips signaling his absolute victory. Before I could launch myself at him, a strong pair of arms wrapped around my shoulders and pulled me back. It was David. My husband had burst through the hospital doors, breathless and frantic, his eyes darting between Detective Ramirez, the hovering nurses, and my tear-streaked face. David, a cybersecurity analyst, built his career on identifying threats and neutralizing them with calculating precision. He took one look at my brother and instantly understood we were under attack. He pulled me against his chest, shielding me from the hostile glares of hospital staff who overheard the detective. David demanded Ramirez back off until we had legal representation present, making it clear I would not answer another question without a defense attorney. But Bradley was already shifting his strategy. Knowing he successfully planted the seed of my guilt in the police minds, he needed to cement absolute control over the victims. With David physically blocking me, Bradley turned to the hospital administration. He reached into his designer briefcase, pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, and slammed them onto the reception counter. He proudly announced to the head nurse and attending physician that he held the sole medical power of attorney for Thomas and Catherine. He claimed that because I was now the prime suspect in an active attempted homicide investigation, my presence was a direct, lethal threat to their safety. I listened in sheer horror as my brother weaponized the legal system against me in real time. He ordered the administration to revoke my visitation rights immediately, instructing staff to flag my name in the security system and explicitly stating I was to receive zero medical updates regarding their condition. The hospital risk management team swooped in within minutes. They reviewed the notarized documents and quickly sided with the golden child. Two burly security guards approached David and me, their expressions stern. They informed us I was legally barred from the intensive care unit. I could not see my mother or hold my father's hand. If I tried stepping past the double doors, they would have me arrested for trespassing and violating a protective medical order. They physically escorted David and me out, pushing us into the cold night while my parents lay attached to ventilators upstairs. The next 48 hours were a chaotic blur of unimaginable agony. My business was entirely boarded up by city officials. Crime scene tape stretched across the glass doors of my commercial kitchen, signaling the death of my life work. I sat in our living room with David, endlessly refreshing local news sites, waiting for a leak about the poisoning, waiting for an update I was legally forbidden to receive. Desperation clawed at my chest. I knew my parents kept a fireproof lockbox in their home office containing their medical histories, insurance policies, and original drafts of their estate planning documents. I figured if I could get my hands on those files, I could prove to Detective Ramirez that Bradley was lying about the inheritance timeline. I told David I needed to go to their house. I still had my spare key. I needed to find anything exposing my brother's financial desperation. I drove to my parents' upscale suburban estate, parking a block away to avoid drawing attention from nosy neighbors. The neighborhood was dead quiet, completely oblivious to the tragedy unfolding behind closed doors. I walked quickly up the brick path, glancing nervously around before sliding my familiar key into the front door lock. I turned it, but the mechanism refused to budge. I pulled it out and tried again, jiggling the handle with increasing panic. The key slid in, but the internal pins were different. The lock did not turn. I stepped back, staring at the brass handle in utter disbelief. Bradley had changed the locks. In the span of 2 days, while our mother and father fought for their lives on life support machines, my brother coordinated with a locksmith to secure the property under his exclusive control. I walked around the perimeter of the sprawling stone house, my heart hammering furiously against my ribs. I crept toward the large bay windows of the formal dining room, desperate to see what was happening inside. I cupped my hands against the cold glass and peered through the sheer curtains. The sight that greeted me made my blood run freezing cold. The house was full of strangers. Men and women in sharp business suits walked through my parents' home with clipboards, tablet computers, and digital cameras. Bradley stood in the center of the room, pointing aggressively at my mother-prized antique collections. I watched in absolute disgust as one stranger carefully inspected a rare Ming Dynasty vase, typed something into an iPad, and attached a small white sticker to its base. They were private estate appraisers. My parents were not even dead, and Bradley was already pricing out their belongings. He walked the appraisers through the house, pointing out expensive oil paintings, heirloom silver sets, and custom furniture. He calculated the exact liquidation value of everything they owned. He was preparing to cash out the moment the heart monitors flatlined. He had successfully orchestrated a total hostile takeover of my family. He had framed me for murder, destroyed my catering business, weaponized the medical system to keep me away from the victims, and physically locked me out of my childhood home. I stood right outside in the freezing cold air, completely isolated and legally defenseless against a man liquidating our family history for a quick payout. His sheer audacity left me paralyzed. He was erasing me from our parents' lives with a few forged signatures and a changed lock. Every memory there was being boxed up and tagged for sale. I realized then that Bradley was not just a greedy golden child. He was a highly calculated predator, and I was entirely trapped in his web. The drive back to my house felt like navigating a suffocating fog. I gripped the steering wheel, my mind racing with the horrific reality of my brother's hostile takeover. Inside my front door, my cell phone vibrated violently. It was my event coordinator. The local news had gotten wind of the police raid on my commercial kitchen. Footage of hazmat teams hauling away my mixers broadcasted across evening news channels. The fallout was instantaneous and catastrophic. My email inbox flooded with frantic messages from panicked brides demanding their non-refundable deposits back. Corporate event managers called to abruptly terminate our exclusive contracts. They cited moral clauses and public relations nightmares. In less than 24 hours, the multi-million-dollar empire I had built was reduced to absolute ash. I collapsed on the sofa, the crushing weight of impending bankruptcy threatening to break my sanity. David sat beside me, gently, pulling my phone from my shaking hands. He muted the notifications and pulled me into his chest. He promised me he would find the digital trail Bradley was hiding, but we both knew David needed a direct access point to my brother. Secure network. We were locked out of the estate, banned from the hospital, and isolated. I felt the walls of my life closing in. I was drowning with no lifeline in sight. Then a sharp ping echoed from David's encrypted messaging app. He grabbed his tablet, his eyes narrowing as he read the screen. He turned the device toward me. It was a message from an unregistered burner number, but the text was unmistakable. It read that we needed to meet immediately alone at a rundown diner on the edge of the city. It was signed by Nia. My sister-in-law was the last person I expected to reach out. At the hospital, she had stood silently behind Bradley, her expression an unreadable mask. But David insisted this could be the break we desperately needed. We drove to the diner under the cover of darkness. Parking in the dimly lit alleyway, I pushed open the glass door and spotted Nia sitting in a corner booth, her back facing the window. She looked entirely different from the polished woman standing in the intensive care unit. She wore a heavy trench coat pulled tight around her shoulders, her face devoid of makeup and heavy circles bruising the skin under her eyes. She looked terrified. I slid into the booth across from her, David taking the aisle seat to shield our conversation. I asked Naya why she called us here. I braced myself for a trap, expecting her to deliver a legal threat from Bradley, or demand I sign over my business to drop the fabricated charges. Instead, Naya reached across the sticky table and grabbed my hand. Her grip was desperate, her skin ice cold. She looked me dead in the eye and said she believed me. She knew I did not poison Thomas and Catherine. The sheer relief of hearing someone validate my innocence almost brought me to tears. But Nia's expression remained deadly serious. As an emergency room nurse, Nia explained she had seen her fair share of toxic ingestions. She knew the clinical realities of ethylene glycol poisoning. It was not a crime of sudden passion. It was a slow, deliberate, and highly calculated method of execution. It required purchasing the chemical, disguising its syrupy texture, masking the bitter almond scent, and watching the victims ingest it without showing an ounce of remorse. Nia leaned closer, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. She revealed that when she and Bradley returned to their townhouse after the hospital confrontation, his behavior was chillingly abnormal. A normal son whose parents were clinging to life on dialysis machines would be pacing the floors, weeping or frantically calling specialists. Bradley did none of those things. Nia told us that Bradley walked into their house, poured himself a glass of expensive scotch, and went straight into his home office. He locked the heavy wooden door behind him. Nia, driven by sharp nursing instincts and a growing sense of dread, had quietly crept down the hallway and peered through the gap in the doorframe. She watched her husband methodically factory reset every single laptop, tablet, and external hard drive on his desk. He was executing a total digital wipe. He was systematically destroying digital evidence of his financial ruin, his communication with loan sharks, and his search history regarding industrial toxins. He was erasing the digital footprints of a murderer. I asked Nia why she was risking everything to tell us this. If Bradley found out she was conspiring with the prime suspect, he would destroy her. Nia's eyes filled with a primal protective fury. She explained that she was not just a nurse, she was a mother to a young son. She realized with horrifying clarity that a man capable of feeding antifreeze to his own parents to secure a trust fund would not hesitate to harm his wife or child if they ever became a financial liability or stood in his way. She was sleeping next to a sociopath, and she was terrified for her boy life. Nia swore to help us completely tear Bradley down once and for all. She proposed an unlikely and highly dangerous alliance. David had the necessary cybersecurity expertise needed to recover deleted files and trace encrypted financial records. I had the fierce determination to clear my name and protect our parents. But Nia had the one thing we lacked. She had physical access. She slept in the same house as the suspect. She had access to his vehicle, his hidden compartments, and his private office space. She vowed to become our inside woman, risking her own safety, to gather the physical proof we needed to hand to Detective Ramirez. We sat in that dimly lit diner and forged a pact of absolute survival. We were going to hunt the golden child together. The next 3 days moved at an agonizingly slow pace. While my husband David chipped away at the encrypted firewalls protecting my brother's financial secrets, I paced the floorboards until my feet ached. The catering business I had poured my soul into was completely shuttered. I needed to know if my parents were going to survive the horrific chemical assault my brother had unleashed on them. I was legally barred from the hospital. The medical power of attorney Bradley possessed meant any official inquiry I made was instantly shut down. I was completely reliant on Nia to provide updates. Early Thursday morning, my cell phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. The caller identification displayed a scrambled number. I answered immediately, my heart pounding against my ribs. Nia's voice on the other end was hushed and urgent. She was currently working a grueling double shift in the emergency room, but she had managed to access the intensive care unit patient registry. She told me the medical staff had flushed the remaining poison from their systems using dialysis. The heavy sedatives were finally being lifted. Thomas and Catherine were waking up. They were weak, disoriented, and hooked up to a dozen monitoring machines, but they had officially regained consciousness. Nia insisted I needed to be there. We both knew Bradley would manipulate them the second he had a chance. He would twist the narrative, whisper his fabricated lies into their ears, and ensure they believed I was the monster who served them poisoned tarts. Nia told me to drive to the hospital immediately and park near the underground loading dock. She mapped out a blind spot in the security camera coverage to prop open a service door. It was incredibly risky. If the hospital administrators caught an off-duty nurse smuggling a barred homicide suspect into the intensive care unit, Nia would lose her medical license instantly. But she was willing to risk her entire career to help me uncover the truth. I threw on a dark jacket and pulled a baseball cap low over my face. David drove, his hands gripping the steering wheel. He dropped me off near the concrete loading bays, promising to circle the block and monitor the hospital network for security alerts. I slipped through the heavy metal service door just as Nia had promised. She was waiting for me in the dimly lit concrete corridor, wearing her blue surgical scrubs and carrying a spare white lab coat. She shoved the coat into my arms and told me to put it on quickly. We walked briskly through the labyrinth of back hallways, avoiding the main elevators. My pulse roared in my ears, drowning out the ambient noise of the busy hospital. Nia swiped her security badge at the restricted entrance of the intensive care ward. The heavy doors clicked open, revealing a sterile corridor lined with patient rooms. She pointed toward a room at the far end of the hall. She whispered that Bradley was currently in the cafeteria taking a business call, giving me a 5-minute window before he returned. I nodded, my throat too tight to formulate words of gratitude. I walked down the hallway, my legs feeling like lead weights. The rhythmic beeping of cardiac monitors filled the air. When I reached the glass door of their room, I stopped and took a shaky breath. Thomas and Catherine were lying in adjacent hospital beds. They looked incredibly frail, but they were awake. The breathing tubes had been removed, replaced by clear plastic oxygen masks resting over their noses and mouths. Seeing them alive, actually breathing on their own, broke the dam of emotions I had been holding back for days. Hot, heavy tears streamed down my face. I pushed the door open and rushed into the room, abandoning all caution. I hurried straight to my mother's bedside, sobbing with absolute relief. I leaned over the metal bed rail, my heart overflowing with a desperate need to comfort her. I reached out and gently grasped her frail, bruised hand. I told her how terrified I had been, how much I loved her, and how I thought I had lost them both forever. I expected her to squeeze my fingers. I expected to see a flicker of maternal warmth, a shared moment of survival after a horrific brush with death. But as my tear-filled eyes met hers, the relief in my chest instantly evaporated, replaced by a freezing, terrifying dread. Catherine's eyes were completely devoid of any affection. There was no relief. There was no love. She stared at me with a look of absolute, chilling contempt. It was the same look of disgust she used when criticizing me, but magnified by 1,000. She did not say a word. She did not need to. Her actions spoke with a devastating clarity that shattered my heart into a million irreparable pieces. With a deliberate movement, my mother pulled her hand out of my grasp. She yanked her fingers away from mine as if my skin were covered in a burning disease. She turned her head sharply toward the wall, refusing to look at me. I stood entirely frozen, my hands still suspended in the empty air. I looked over at my father. Thomas was watching the entire exchange. His expression mirrored my mother's cold, detached hostility. He slowly turned his face away from me, staring blankly at the ceiling tiles. They believed him. The realization hit me like a freight train. My parents, the people who had raised me, genuinely believed that I had attempted to murder them in cold blood for a trust fund I never even wanted. They believed the golden child. I backed away from the bed, the air completely knocked out of my lungs. I had risked everything to sneak into this hospital room, to offer them comfort, only to be treated like a convicted assassin by my own flesh and blood. They had made their choice. It was over. The heavy sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the sterile hospital corridor before I could even process the magnitude of their silent condemnation. The distinct authoritative tread belonged to someone walking with absolute purpose. Nia, who had been keeping watch by the door, suddenly whipped her head around. Panic flared in her dark eyes. She darted into the room, grabbed my arm, and shoved me forcefully toward the small, shadowed alcove behind the massive privacy curtain near the window. She hissed at me to stay absolutely silent and keep out of sight. I stumbled backward into the narrow space, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I pulled the heavy, antibacterial fabric tightly around me, leaving only a microscopic sliver of space to peer through. My breathing was shallow and ragged. I pressed my back flat against the cold plaster wall, terrified that the erratic thumping of my chest would give me away. Seconds later, the glass door to the intensive care unit slid open. Detective Ramirez strode into the room. He carried his signature leather-bound notepad, his face a mask of strict, unyielding professionalism. But he was not alone. Right behind him, trailing like a desperate shadow, was my brother. Bradley looked entirely different from the smug, arrogant man who had ordered my eviction from the hospital waiting room. Now he was sweating profusely. A thick sheen of perspiration coated his forehead, and his tailored designer shirt clung to his back. He kept wiping his clammy palms on his trousers, his eyes darting frantically around the room, assessing the medical equipment, the monitors, and finally, our parents. He looked like a man walking to the gallows. Detective Ramirez approached the foot of my father's bed. He did not offer any warm greetings or gentle pleasantries. He was a man strictly searching for facts to close an attempted double homicide case. Ramirez pulled a pen from his breast pocket and looked directly at Thomas. He asked if my father was lucid enough to answer a few critical questions regarding the events that led to their hospitalization. My father gave a weak, raspy cough and nodded his head slowly. The tension in the room thickened, transforming the cold hospital air into something heavy and suffocating. Behind my curtain, I held my breath. I prayed that the near-death experience had knocked some sense into my parents. I naively hoped that surviving a lethal dose of industrial antifreeze would force them to finally see the monster they had raised. Ramirez clicked his pen. He stated that the toxicology reports definitively confirmed the presence of ethylene glycol in their systems. He explained that the poison was likely ingested through a sweet liquid, deliberately masked to hide its deadly chemical nature. The detective leaned closer, his dark eyes locking onto my father's frail face. He asked the single defining question of the entire investigation. Who prepared their drinks that afternoon? Who specifically handed them the beverages containing the poison? The silence that followed was agonizing. The rhythmic beeping of the cardiac monitors seemed to amplify, keeping time with the frantic pounding in my ears. Thomas did not answer immediately. Instead, my father slowly turned his head away from the detective. He looked past the medical equipment and locked eyes directly with Bradley. I watched through the narrow slit in the curtain as a silent, terrifying conversation unfolded between the father and the golden child. Bradley was visibly trembling now. He stared back at our father, his eyes wide with a pathetic, desperate pleading. It was the look of a coward begging for salvation. In that split second, a horrific realization washed over me. My parents knew. They knew exactly who handed them those tainted glasses. They remembered Bradley pouring the drinks. They remembered the argument about the drained retirement accounts. They knew their precious son had fed them poison. Thomas turned his gaze away from Bradley and looked back at Detective Ramirez. My father's expression hardened, his jaw setting into a stubborn, resolved line. He cleared his throat, pushing past the damage the breathing tubes had left behind. When he spoke, his voice was raspy, but completely unwavering. "It was Caroline," my father stated, not breaking eye contact with the detective. "She brought us tea with her tarts. She wanted us dead because of the house." The words sliced through the air like a jagged blade. Beside him, Catherine nodded her head in fervent agreement, her eyes cold and calculating. She added that I had been furious and unstable, demanding my inheritance early. My world shattered. The floor completely vanished beneath my feet. They knew Bradley did it, but they were choosing to frame me anyway. They were actively, consciously willing to send their innocent daughter to a maximum security prison for the rest of her life, simply to protect the son who had just tried to murder them. The depth of their betrayal was unfathomable. It was a level of evil I could not even begin to comprehend. They were sacrificing my entire existence to maintain the flawless illusion of their golden child. The sheer injustice of their perjury broke something fundamental inside my brain. The need for self-preservation vanished, replaced by an overwhelming, blinding fury. I could not stay hidden in the shadows while they assassinated my character and destroyed my freedom. I shoved the heavy privacy curtain aside. The metal rings screeched loudly against the ceiling track, shattering the quiet atmosphere of the hospital room. I stepped out into the harsh fluorescent light, my face stained with tears of absolute rage. The reaction was instantaneous. My mother let out a sharp gasp, clutching her hospital blanket. My father, eyes widened in genuine shock. Bradley stumbled backward, his face draining of all color as he realized I had heard every single word of their treacherous conspiracy. Detective Ramirez spun around, his hand instinctively dropping toward the utility belt at his waist. He stared at me, his eyes narrowing as he quickly assessed the situation. I opened my mouth to scream the truth, to tell the detective they were lying to protect the real killer standing right next to him, but the words never made it past my lips. Ramirez did not care about my outrage. He only cared about the victim's statements he had just officially recorded. Ramirez stepped forward, his imposing frame blocking my path to Bradley. He reached to his belt and pulled out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. He informed me that based on the direct eyewitness testimony of the victims, I was officially under arrest for 2 counts of attempted murder in the first degree. I stood frozen in absolute disbelief as he grabbed my wrists, forcefully twisting my arms behind my back. The cold metal clamped down hard on my skin, the ratchet mechanism clicking with a sickening final sound. Ramirez recited my Miranda rights in a flat, clinical tone, his voice drowning out my desperate pleas for justice. As the detective aggressively marched me toward the hospital room door, I looked over my shoulder one last time. Bradley was no longer sweating. He stood at the foot of our parents' beds, his posture relaxed, a sick, triumphant smirk spreading across his face. My parents refused to look at me, keeping their eyes glued to the blank television screen on the wall. They had successfully executed their plan. I was being hauled away in handcuffs, my life completely destroyed, while the real monster walked free. The heavy doors of the intensive care unit swung violently shut behind me, permanently severing me from the family I once knew. Detective Ramirez marched me down the hospital corridors. Nurses and doctors I passed hours before now stopped and stared, their eyes tracking the glint of the steel handcuffs binding my wrists. I kept my head bowed, my vision blurred by humiliated tears. The cold night air hit my face as the detective guided me into the back seat of the cruiser. The heavy door slammed shut, sealing me inside a hard plastic cage. As the police car pulled away, I looked back at the towering building. My parents were resting comfortably after handing their innocent daughter over to the authorities. They had signed away my freedom without hesitation. The night I spent in the county holding cell was a descent into pure psychological torture. The concrete walls were freezing, and the thin blanket provided no comfort against the biting chill of the concrete bench. I sat in the dim light, replaying the horrific betrayal on an endless loop. My father, raspy voice accusing me. My mother, cold, calculating nod. They had stared death in the face, felt the poison shutting down their organs, and actively chose to protect the son who poured it down their throats. I realized then that I had never truly had parents. I only had 2 people who tolerated my existence until I became a convenient sacrifice for their golden child. I did not sleep at all. I watched the shadows shift across the cell bars, waiting for the morning light to bring resolution to this nightmare. When the morning sun finally rose over the city skyline, a guard rattled the metal bars and called my name. She informed me my bail had been posted. I was led through a maze of sterile processing rooms, handed my personal belongings in a clear plastic bag, and directed toward the front exit. I pushed open the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the crisp morning air. David was standing by our car, his posture rigid, his jaw clenched tight. The moment he saw me, the hard lines of his face fractured. He sprinted across the pavement and pulled me into a fierce, desperate embrace. I collapsed against him, my legs giving out as the adrenaline left my system. I sobbed into his shoulder, clinging to his jacket like a lifeline. He held me tightly, whispering that I was safe now. During the drive back to our house, David explained the logistics of my release. The judge had set an astronomical bail amount, treating me as a severe flight risk due to the attempted murder charges. David leveraged the equity in our home and drained our personal savings accounts to secure the bond. We were financially bleeding, but David did not care about the money. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. He was normally a calm cybersecurity analyst who approached every crisis with quiet logic. But looking at his profile in the morning light, I saw a terrifying fury burning in his eyes. My toxic family crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and David was ready to wage war. We arrived at our home. I walked into the kitchen, feeling like a fragile shell of the woman I was yesterday. I sat at the island counter staring blankly at the wall, completely broken. I told David that it was over. Bradley had the medical power of attorney, control of the estate, and my parents acting as his star witnesses. The police believed the victims. I told my husband I was going to prison for a crime I did not commit, and there was nothing we could do to fight it. David walked over to the counter and placed a hot cup of tea in front of me. He looked me dead in the eye. He told me to drink the tea and rest because we were not surrendering. He stated with absolute chilling confidence that Bradley was an arrogant amateur playing a dangerous game against a seasoned professional. Bradley thought wiping his hard drives would erase his sins, but David knew better. David explained that the internet never truly forgets anything, and digital ghosts always leave a trail. He kissed my forehead, turned around, and walked straight into our home office. Over the next few hours, I watched my husband transform our quiet study into a high-tech war room. David dragged 2 extra monitors from the closet and linked them to his primary workstation. He booted up encrypted servers, his fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard. Lines of complex code cascaded down the dark screens. He was no longer just a supportive husband. He was a cyber predator locking onto his prey. David explained his brilliant strategy without looking away from the glowing dual monitors. He told me that when Nia saw Bradley Factory reset his laptops, Bradley was only deleting local storage. He failed to account for automated cloud backups connected to his home router. David launched a brute force program designed to bypass the basic security firewall on Bradley network. Because David helped Bradley set up his smart home devices years ago, he remembered the architectural flaws in his digital ecosystem. Within minutes, David penetrated the external defenses. He gained backdoor access to the router Bradley used every single day. From there, David initiated a massive data extraction protocol. He began pulling deleted cache files, cloud logs, and hidden financial records Bradley thought were destroyed. David's screen lit up with hundreds of encrypted folders downloading in real time. My husband sat back in his chair, the glow of the monitors reflecting in his eyes. He promised he was going to digitally dismantle my brother's entire existence. He was going to drag every dirty secret Bradley had into the light, and we were going to use those secrets to burn the golden child to the ground. The ambient glow of the dual monitors cast long shadows across David's concentrated face. I stood behind him, my hands gripping the back of his ergonomic mesh chair, my eyes locked on the cascading streams of data flooding the screens. The extraction protocol was pulling gigabytes of hidden information from the deep recesses of my brother's network. It took David nearly 3 hours of relentless, aggressive coding to crack the secondary encryption wall Bradley had hastily thrown up. When the firewall finally collapsed, a series of highly organized folders populated the desktop. David did not waste a single second. He bypassed the standard document folders and dove straight into the hidden financial ledgers and secure offshore communication logs. The silence in our home office was heavy, broken only by the rapid, rhythmic clacking of David's mechanical keyboard. Then, he stopped typing. He leaned forward, his eyes scanning a heavily redacted document he had just forced open. He let out a low, disbelieving breath. I asked him what he found. David turned his head slowly, his expression a mix of absolute disgust and terrifying clarity. He told me to look at the screen. What I saw instantly shattered the flawless, pristine image of the golden child my parents worshipped. Bradley was not a brilliant tech visionary. He was a complete and utter fraud. The corporate tax returns and bankruptcy filings David pulled from a hidden cloud drive proved that Bradley's software startup had completely folded over 2 years ago. His company did not just fail, it imploded spectacularly under the weight of severe financial mismanagement and gross negligence. My brother had been lying to everyone. To keep up appearances, he had created a complex network of dummy corporations and shell websites to make it look like he was still operating a massive, profitable enterprise. He was essentially running a digital ghost town. My parents had spent the last 2 years bragging to their wealthy country club friends about a visionary CEO's son, who was actually unemployed and drowning in corporate debt. He leased his luxury sports car. He rented his designer office space by the hour just to take photos for his social media profiles. The entire foundation of his golden child persona was an elaborate, expensive, and desperate lie. I felt a sickening wave of revulsion wash over me. While I had been working 80-hour weeks in a commercial kitchen to build a legitimate, thriving catering business, my parents were actively disowning me to praise a man who did not even have a real job. But the business bankruptcy was merely the tip of the terrifying iceberg. David clicked into a hidden folder labeled with a string of random numbers. Inside were hundreds of transaction logs from unregulated offshore cryptocurrency exchanges. Bradley had not just lost his investors' money, he had developed a severe, debilitating gambling addiction. He had been leveraging highly volatile digital assets, placing catastrophic bets on anonymous platforms, and losing millions in the rapid process. When the traditional banks inevitably cut him off, he turned to much darker avenues for cash. David opened a secure messaging application cache that Bradley had tried to wipe from his hard drive. The messages were entirely unencrypted now, and they were utterly terrifying. They were not from standard creditors or professional debt collectors. They were from ruthless offshore loan sharks. Bradley owed them over $3 million in hard cash. The messages were graphic, violent, and highly specific. The senders detailed exactly what they were going to do to Bradley, to Naya, and to their young son if the massive debt was not settled by the end of the month. They attached surveillance photos of Bradley leaving his favorite coffee shop, proving he was being actively watched. My brother was not just broke. He was a dead man walking. The panic I had seen in his eyes at the hospital suddenly made absolute chilling sense. He was not sweating because of a police investigation. He was sweating because ruthless criminals were breathing down his neck, demanding $3 million he did not have. Then, David found the final, most devastating piece of the puzzle. He cross-referenced Bradley's frantic cryptocurrency deposits with external wire transfers. He pulled up a series of highly classified banking trails that completely stopped my heart. I recognized the unique routing numbers immediately. They belonged to Thomas and Catherine's primary retirement accounts. My brother had not just waited for a legal trust fund transfer. He had already illegally gained backdoor access to our parents' life savings. Over the past 6 months, Bradley had been systematically draining their retirement funds, forging their digital signatures, and funneling hundreds of thousands directly into his offshore gambling accounts. He had literally stolen the money my parents had worked their entire lives to save, and he had lost it all on digital bets. The timeline of the final wire transfers perfectly aligned with the day of the poisoning. David pointed to the glowing screen, tracing the dates with his index finger. Our parents must have discovered the missing funds that morning. They must have confronted him about the empty accounts. That was why he handed them the spiked drinks. Bradley needed them dead before they could report the massive financial theft to the authorities. He needed the trust fund transferred immediately to cover the $3 million he had already stolen and lost. and to pay off the violent loan sharks threatening his life. He was willing to murder the two people who worshipped him just to balance his ledgers and save his own skin. And the most horrifying part was that Thomas and Catherine knew he stole from them. They knew he poisoned them, and they still chose to frame me for attempted murder rather than see their precious son go to prison. They were perfectly willing to let me rot in a concrete cell forever so their beloved golden child could walk away with my blood on his hands. The sickening reality of my parents' complicity hung in the air of our home office like thick smoke. David leaned back in his chair, rubbing his tired eyes. He had successfully mapped out Bradley's entire financial ruin, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that my brother had the motive to commit double homicide. But David quickly pointed out a massive legal hurdle. The digital evidence was incredibly damning for fraud and elder abuse, but it remained entirely circumstantial regarding the actual physical act of poisoning. A sharp defense attorney could argue that a desperate gambling addict might steal from his parents without necessarily feeding them industrial chemicals. To completely exonerate me and get the attempted murder charges dropped, we needed the murder weapon. We needed physical proof directly tying Bradley to the ethylene glycol. I immediately reached for my encrypted burner phone and dialed Nia. She answered on the first ring, her voice a barely audible whisper. I quickly explained the horrifying truth David had just uncovered from the network logs. I told her about the offshore loan sharks, the $3 million debt, and the stolen retirement funds. I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Naya was a seasoned emergency room nurse who dealt with trauma every single day. But realizing she shared a bed with a man capable of such calculated evil sent a tremor through her usually steady voice. I told her we desperately needed the physical container of poison. If the police did not find it at my parents' house, Bradley must have taken it with him to dispose of it or hide it. Nia did not hesitate. She told us to keep the line open and stay perfectly quiet. She explained that Bradley had just taken a heavy dose of sleeping pills, completely exhausted from the stress of orchestrating his massive cover-up. She was sitting in the dark on the edge of their bed, listening to his deep, rhythmic breathing. Through the secure phone connection, David and I listened in agonizing suspense. I heard the faint rustle of bedsheets as Nia slowly stood up. Every creak of their townhouse floorboards sounded like a gunshot through the phone speaker. Nia whispered that she was grabbing the keys to his leased luxury SUV from his jacket pocket. She crept silently down the hallway and slipped into their attached garage. The heavy concrete walls provided a temporary shield of safety. Nia told us she was standing in front of his pristine black vehicle. She pressed the unlock button on the key fob, wincing at the electronic chirp that echoed in the quiet garage. She started her search in the front seat, quietly opening the glove compartment and checking the center console. She found nothing but toll receipts and empty coffee cups. She moved to the back seats, checking under the floor mats and inside the seatback pockets. The tension was suffocating. Every passing second increased the risk of Bradley waking up and finding his wife tearing through his vehicle. I clutched David's hand, my knuckles turning white as we listened to Nia opening the heavy rear liftgate of the SUV. She whispered that the main cargo area was completely empty. David leaned into the microphone and quietly suggested she check the hidden compartment beneath the trunk floorboards where the spare tire was kept. I heard the sound of Velcro tearing and the heavy thud of the cargo mat being lifted. Then, a sharp, sudden gasp echoed through the phone speaker. Nia's voice trembled with a mixture of terror and absolute vindication. She found it, stashed deep inside the circular well of the spare tire, wrapped carelessly in an old gym towel, was a large plastic jug of industrial engine coolant. Nia carefully pulled the fabric back. She whispered the brand name printed on the bright yellow label. It was a high-grade, concentrated antifreeze formula containing a lethal percentage of ethylene glycol. The safety seal was broken, and the jug was practically half empty. Bradley had wiped the exterior smooth, likely trying to remove his fingerprints, but he was arrogant enough to keep the murder weapon hidden in his own vehicle, believing no one would ever suspect the golden child. But the poison was not the only thing buried in that dark compartment. Nia let out another shocked breath. Tucked directly beneath the toxic jug was a thick manila envelope. She carefully slid the envelope out and opened the metal clasp. Through the phone line, I heard the crisp rustle of heavy legal paper. Nia began reading the headings of the documents in a hushed, horrified tone. It was a completely forged, updated version of my parents' estate planning portfolio. Bradley had drawn up fake transfer documents dictating that all remaining liquid assets, the family house, and the entire investment trust were to be immediately surrendered to him. The paperwork was dated for the exact same morning my parents were poisoned. He had fully prepared to force their dying hands to sign the papers, or simply forge their signatures the moment their hearts stopped beating. David quickly instructed Nia to photograph every single piece of evidence. He told her to capture the warning labels on the coolant jug, the broken seal, the exact placement inside the tire well, and every single page of the forged legal documents. We listened to the rapid, consecutive clicks of her smartphone camera shutter. She was capturing high-resolution images of the physical proof that would secure my freedom and guarantee my brother destruction. Nia worked with the meticulous precision of a medical professional documenting a crime scene. Once she secured the photographs, Nia carefully placed the forged documents back inside the manila envelope. She wrapped the plastic jug of antifreeze in the gym towel exactly as she had found it, ensuring the positioning was identical. She lowered the heavy cargo floorboard, pressing the Velcro edges down seamlessly. She closed the SUV liftgate with a soft, controlled push, ensuring the latch clicked shut without making a loud slamming noise. Nia locked the vehicle and quietly made her way back inside the townhouse. She whispered that she was sending the encrypted image files directly to David's secure server. She crept back up the stairs and slipped the car keys into Bradley's jacket pocket before returning to bed. A moment later, our home office monitors lit up with the incoming photographs. I stared at the bright yellow label of the antifreeze jug on the screen, a massive wave of relief washing over my entire body. We finally had the smoking gun. The encrypted images from Nia finally materialized on our home office monitors, displaying the bright yellow industrial antifreeze jug and forged legal documents. We had the physical evidence to clear my name. The suffocating terror of a prison sentence lifted, replaced by an undeniable need for justice. But a dark question continued to claw at my mind. Digital forensics proved Bradley had the motive. Photographs proved he had the murder weapon. None of this explained the horrifying betrayal in the intensive care unit. Why did my parents point their fingers at me? Did they genuinely believe I tried to kill them, or did they choose to sacrifice me anyway? I needed to understand their delusion. I asked David if there was any possible way to know exactly what happened before I walked through the front door. David turned back to his keyboard. He told me that during his initial breach of Bradley Network, he ran a diagnostic sweep of my parents' smart home ecosystem. Because Bradley originally set up their integrated security devices, his digital fingerprints were everywhere. David began filtering through raw data logs, searching for unregistered devices Bradley overlooked during his frantic attempt to wipe his digital history. For 20 agonizing minutes, the only sound was the rapid clicking of mechanical keys. Then David leaned closer to his primary monitor. He highlighted an obscure IP address buried deep within the network registry. He explained it was an active connection linked to a hidden motion-activated camera in my parents' living room. It was an old nanny cam disguised inside a digital picture frame on the fireplace mantel installed years ago. Bradley had successfully deleted the local storage drives connected to their primary security system, but he completely forgot about the hidden camera on the mantel. Because the device was manufactured by a different tech company, it uploaded its encrypted video cache to a separate cloud server. David initiated a bypass protocol, forcing the cloud server to surrender the cached video files from the day of the poisoning. When the download finally completed, David clicked the media file. The high-definition video flickered to life, displaying a wide, unobstructed angle of my parents' formal living room. The timestamp indicated the recording started 45 minutes before I arrived with my bakery box. The video had no audio, but the visual narrative was devastatingly clear. Thomas and Catherine were standing in the center of the room, faces flushed with rage. My father was forcefully waving printed banking statements in Bradley's face. My mother was weeping, clutching her chest. My parents had discovered their drained retirement accounts. They knew the golden child had stolen their life savings. Bradley stood before them, playing the tragic victim. He ran his hands through his hair, dropped to his knees, and buried his face in his hands, feigning an emotional breakdown. In the silent footage, I watched my parents' aggressive postures soften. The anger gave way to that familiar toxic indulgence they always reserved for him. My mother knelt beside him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. Bradley stood up and gestured toward the kitchen, offering to get a drink so they could discuss a solution. He disappeared off camera for 3 minutes. When he returned, he carried 2 crystal glasses filled with a dark liquid. He handed the glasses to Thomas and Catherine with an apologetic posture. He watched them take long, generous sips of the spiked beverages. What happened next will haunt my nightmares forever. Less than 5 minutes after finishing the wine, my father clutched his throat. He dropped his glass, shattering it against the hardwood floor. He collapsed onto his knees, his mouth opening in a silent gasp for air. My mother rushed to help him, but the industrial poison hit her system with equal ferocity. She stumbled backward, crashing into the glass coffee table before sliding onto the rug. They writhed on the floor, their bodies convulsing as the ethylene glycol crystallized in their organs. Thick foam began bubbling from their lips. Through it all, Bradley did not panic. He stood perfectly still in the center of the room, watching his parents choke on the antifreeze he just fed them. The sheer apathy on his face was the definition of absolute evil. My father, clinging to the last fading moments of consciousness, reached a trembling hand up toward his son, begging for salvation. Bradley looked down at his dying father and literally stepped right over his outstretched hand. He ignored their agonizing pleas completely. Bradley headed straight for the oil painting on the far wall. He swung the artwork aside, revealing the hidden safe my parents used to store cash. Bradley punched in the numerical code, swung the steel door open, and emptied the contents into his briefcase. He zipped the bag shut, adjusted his blazer, and casually walked out the front door, leaving them to die a slow death on the living room floor. The video ended, and the screen quickly faded to stark black. I stood frozen in our home office, unable to process the magnitude of the horror I had just witnessed. The missing piece of the puzzle had finally snapped perfectly into place. My parents were completely conscious when the poison took hold. They watched their beloved son hand them the lethal drinks. They watched him stand over their agonizing bodies with dead, apathetic eyes. They watched him rob their safe and abandon them to die. They knew without a shadow of a doubt that Bradley was the monster who tried to murder them. Yet when they miraculously woke up in the intensive care unit, when the detective asked who was responsible for the chemical assault, they chose to protect him. They deliberately pointed their fingers at me. They were willing to let me rot in a maximum security prison to shield a psychopathic killer from the consequences of his actions. Their betrayal was not a tragic misunderstanding. It was a calculated, unforgivable sacrifice. The suffocating silence of our home office was broken by the sharp chime of my email inbox. David and I were still staring at the black screen, where my parents had just willingly died for my brother, only to be resurrected and point their fingers at me. I dragged my gaze away from the monitor and opened the incoming message. It was marked urgent and carried the digital letterhead of a high-powered corporate law firm. The sender was an attorney representing Bradley. My hands trembled with residual adrenaline as I clicked the attachment. I expected a civil suit for emotional distress or perhaps a restraining order extending his control over the family estate. What I read instead was an extortion attempt so blatant and disgusting, it made my stomach churn. The legal document was framed as a highly confidential, out-of-court settlement proposal. Bradley attorney stated that my parents were experiencing profound emotional distress and rapidly declining health due to the stress of a looming criminal trial. They claimed the impending media circus would completely destroy their fragile recovery. Then came the terrifying ultimatum. The lawyer offered a private plea deal. If I legally signed over 100% of my catering company, including all commercial assets, client lists, and liquid capital directly to Bradley, my parents would contact Detective Ramirez. They would officially recant their victim statements. They would tell the police they were confused by the heavy sedatives and had simply misremembered the events of that afternoon. They would drop the attempted murder charges, completely saving me from a lifetime in a maximum security prison. The sheer audacity of the demand hit me like a physical blow. Bradley was not just trying to steal my parents' wealth. He was actively using the threat of my false imprisonment to seize the multi-million-dollar business I had built from nothing. He needed my company to pay off his massive offshore crypto debts. He was holding my freedom hostage for a payout, and Thomas and Catherine were fully complicit in the extortion. David read the legal document over my shoulder, his jaw tight with absolute fury. He reached for the keyboard to send a blistering refusal, but I grabbed his hand. A terrifying, brilliant clarity suddenly washed over me. Bradley thought he had backed me into an inescapable corner. He believed I was a terrified, desperate woman facing decades behind concrete walls. He expected me to fold. I looked at David and told him we were going to give the golden child exactly what he wanted. We were going to hand him the rope he needed to hang himself. David understood instantly. As a cybersecurity expert, he knew that an extortion demand sent through interstate email servers was a federal crime. If we could capture my parents actively conspiring to drop false criminal charges in exchange for financial assets, we would have them dead to rights on felony extortion and obstruction of justice. I needed to perform the most convincing acting job of my entire life. I needed to make them believe I was completely broken. David immediately launched a secure encrypted recording program on his workstation. He verified the legal parameters, ensuring the recording complied with state consent laws. By routing the call through a specific business line that carried an automated monitoring disclosure, I pulled out my cell phone and dialed my parents' home number. The phone rang 3 times before my mother answered. Her voice was crisp, guarded, and entirely devoid of any maternal warmth. I did not say hello. I instantly forced my breathing to become shallow and ragged. I let out a desperate guttural sob, channeling every ounce of genuine trauma and betrayal I had experienced over the past week. I cried into the receiver, begging her not to hang up. I told her I received the legal documents from Bradley's attorney. I played the part of a terrified, cornered animal. I sobbed that the police were threatening to revoke my bail and that I was absolutely terrified of going to prison. I pleaded with her, asking how they could let this happen to me. Catherine did not offer a single word of comfort. She listened to her daughter hyperventilate and simply sighed, a harsh, impatient sound that echoed through the speaker. She told me to stop being so hysterical and listen to reason. "We are offering you a very generous way out of this nightmare," Catherine stated coldly, her voice dripping with condescension. "Bradley has been deeply traumatized by your actions. Your catering business is the only acceptable compensation for the pain you have caused this family." I forced another heavy sob, begging my father to get on the line. I heard the phone shuffle, and Thomas spoke, his tone equally devoid of empathy. He told me that if I signed the commercial transfer agreements by Friday, they would call Detective Ramirez and claim the hospital medications severely altered their memories. They would say they drank bad tea by accident. "You will really drop the murder charges if I give Bradley my entire company?" I asked, my voice trembling perfectly. "You will tell the police you misremembered." "Yes," Thomas confirmed bluntly, sealing his own fate on the digital recording. "Sign the papers and you get your freedom back. It is a simple business transaction. Do not make this harder than it has to be." I let out a long, shuddering breath, whispering my total surrender. I told them I would sign whatever they wanted. I promised to come to their house to finalize the transfer. They smugly agreed and abruptly disconnected the call. The empty dial tone echoed in our home office. I lowered my phone, the tears drying on my face. David stopped the recording and saved the encrypted audio file. The trap was officially set. My toxic family thought they had just won the ultimate victory. They had no idea they just handed me the final nail for their coffins. The trap was officially set. My toxic family thought they had just won the ultimate victory. They had no idea they just handed me the final nail for their coffins. We needed to move swiftly before Bradley could finalize his own desperate plans, or realize his digital footprint had been compromised. David encrypted the audio recording of the extortion call and added it to the massive digital dossier we compiled. The next morning, under heavy gray skies, David and I drove to a discreet diner on the outskirts of the city. We were meeting Detective Ramirez. I told him I had evidence that would definitively close his double homicide case, requiring his immediate and undivided attention. When we arrived, Nia was already sitting in a back booth. As an emergency room nurse, she knew the professional risks of involving herself in an active police investigation outside official channels. But her determination to protect her young son from Bradley outweighed any fear. A few minutes later, Detective Ramirez walked through the diner doors. He wore plain clothes, his detective badge tucked away, though his commanding presence still dominated the space. He stated clearly that whatever we were about to show him had better be worth jeopardizing police procedure. David did not waste a single second. He opened his secure laptop and turned the screen toward the detective. We laid out the mountain of cyber evidence meticulously. David started with the cryptocurrency logs and loan shark debts. He then pulled up the banking trails, proving Bradley had already illegally drained Thomas and Catherine retirement accounts. Ramirez leaned forward, his professional skepticism slowly giving way to sharp, focused interest. Then, Nia placed her encrypted tablet on the table. She swiped through the high-resolution photographs she had taken inside Bradley luxury SUV. The bright yellow jug of industrial ethylene glycol hidden beneath the spare tire glowed on the screen, sitting directly next to the forged estate transfer documents. But the most devastating piece of evidence was yet to come. David clicked play on the recovered nanny cam footage. We sat in silence as the video played out in the dim light of the diner. We watched my parents confront Bradley about the stolen money. We watched him hand them the spiked wine. We watched them collapse, choking and gasping for air, while their beloved son callously stepped over their dying bodies to rob their wall safe. Detective Ramirez watched the footage with absolute disgust. The veteran investigator had seen terrible things in his career, but the sheer cold-blooded nature of Bradley's actions, coupled with the profound betrayal of my parents, struck a deep nerve. He watched the people who had looked him dead in the eye at the hospital and sworn their daughter was an assassin. Ramirez ran a hand over his face, shaking his head in disbelief. He stated that Thomas and Catherine had committed flagrant perjury. They had actively obstructed a major criminal investigation and willingly framed an innocent woman to protect a sociopath. He was utterly repulsed by their malicious deception. I then played the audio recording from the previous night. The sound of my parents extorting me, offering to drop the fabricated murder charges in exchange for my entire catering company, echoed through the small speaker. Ramirez's jaw locked into a rigid line. He declared that we now had them on federal extortion, alongside the perjury and obstruction charges. He looked at me, a newfound respect in his eyes, and formally apologized for arresting me. He admitted he had been manipulated by masterful liars, but promised he would make it right. With the police fully on our side, we forged our justice coalition. Our next moves needed to be flawlessly coordinated. Nia stood up, her posture radiating absolute strength. She announced she was leaving immediately to meet with a trusted family lawyer. Armed with the evidence of Bradley's massive gambling debts, his involvement with violent loan sharks, and the murder weapon hidden in their family vehicle, she was formally filing for an emergency restraining order. She was also filing for immediate, unassailable divorce and full custody of their son. She refused to let her child spend another minute legally tied to a monster. She hugged me tightly, thanking me for helping her see the truth, and walked out of the diner to reclaim her life. Ramirez, David, and I remained in the booth to finalize the sting operation. My parents and Bradley expected me to arrive at their house on Friday evening to sign away my business. They believed they held all the power. Ramirez outlined a highly tactical plan. I would attend the meeting exactly as instructed. David would be with me, acting as my defeated, supportive husband. Ramirez would position a team of undercover officers around the perimeter of the estate. He would also have a heavily armed tactical unit stationed entirely out of sight, ready to breach the property on his direct command. We synchronized our watches and established a covert audio feed. David would wear a microscopic wire, transmitting the entire confrontation directly to Ramirez and his listening team. The goal was to let Bradley and my parents completely incriminate themselves on a live police broadcast. We needed them to verbally confirm the extortion and acknowledge their false police reports before springing the trap. Ramirez promised that the moment Bradley presented the transfer documents and tried to enforce the illegal plea deal, the police would swarm the room. The trap was finally set with absolute lethal legal precision. We walked out of the quiet diner with a crystal clear, unified purpose driving our every single step. I was no longer a helpless victim waiting for the slaughter. I was now the meticulous architect of their total and impending destruction. The golden child and his toxic enablers had 24 hours left to enjoy their false victory. Friday night would bring a massive, inescapable reckoning that would permanently destroy the wicked illusions they had built. The drive to my parents' sprawling suburban estate felt entirely different this time. I was no longer the frantic, terrified daughter rushing to save them, nor the heartbroken victim of their vicious betrayal. I was the architect of their impending downfall. David drove our car with steady, practiced precision, his hands relaxed on the steering wheel. Underneath his crisp button-down shirt, the microscopic wire was securely taped to his chest, broadcasting a crystal-clear audio feed directly to Detective Ramirez and the tactical unit waiting silently in unmarked vehicles just outside the neighborhood gates. The autumn air was bitterly cold as we stepped out of the car, but I did not shiver. I felt a profound, absolute calm wash over me. We walked up the familiar brick pathway, the same path where I had dropped my bakery box just a week ago. David squeezed my hand once, a silent promise that we were ready. I reached out and pressed the glowing doorbell, waiting for the golden child to welcome us into his trap. The heavy oak door swung open to reveal Bradley. He was dressed in a bespoke, immaculate designer suit, complete with a silk pocket square and a luxury watch that I knew was financed by his violent loan sharks. He wore the sickeningly confident smile of a man who believed he had outsmarted everyone in the room. He ushered us inside with a sweeping, magnanimous gesture, playing the gracious host in a house he had basically stolen. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not offer a single word of genuine comfort. He simply pointed us toward the formal living room, his voice dripping with artificial sympathy as he warned us that our parents were still recovering from my supposed attack. David and I walked past him without a word. When we entered the grand living room, the sheer theatricality of the scene almost made me laugh. Thomas and Catherine were positioned perfectly in the center of the room, seated in matching medical wheelchairs. They wore plush cashmere blankets draped over their laps, looking frail and diminished, yet their eyes burned with an unmistakable, arrogant triumph. The coffee table between us was cleared of all its usual antique centerpieces. In their place sat a thick, neatly bound stack of legal documents and an expensive fountain pen. The transfer agreements for my entire catering company. Bradley walked around us and stood directly behind our parents' wheelchairs, placing one hand on my mother's shoulder in a picture-perfect display of filial devotion. It was a grotesque family portrait. They stared at me with expectant, greedy expressions, fully believing they had successfully broken my spirit. I took a seat on the edge of the velvet sofa, keeping my posture deliberately submissive to play into their delusion. David sat beside me, his face a mask of defeated resignation. The hidden microphone captured every single breath, every subtle movement in the room. I looked down at the contract, then up at the people who had raised me, waiting for them to initiate their extortion on the live police broadcast. My mother cleared her throat, adjusting her cashmere blanket with deliberate slowness. She looked at me with a sickeningly sweet expression, her voice adopting the gentle, patronizing tone she always used when she was about to deliver a crushing insult. She told me that this entire ordeal had been a profound tragedy for the family. She claimed that lying in that hospital bed, hovering between life and death, had given her a profound sense of perspective about forgiveness and grace. She actually had the audacity to say that despite the unspeakable pain I had caused them, they were willing to look past my horrific actions. She spun a nauseating narrative about how family must always forgive, how blood ties require us to extend mercy even to those who deeply betray us. She spoke as if she were a benevolent saint pardoning a wicked sinner, completely ignoring the fact that she was actively blackmailing her innocent daughter to save the son who had actually poured poison down her throat. Catherine leaned slightly forward in her wheelchair, her sweet tone hardening into a sharp, reprimanding lecture. She stated that my entire life had been a series of disappointing behaviors and rebellious choices. She brought up my refusal to attend business school, my insistence on building a catering company from scratch, and my constant failure to uphold the prestigious image our family demanded. She told me that giving up my business today was not just a legal settlement but a necessary moral punishment. She claimed that I needed to experience a total financial reset to finally understand the value of family loyalty. She looked me dead in the eye and said that handing my multi-million-dollar company over to Bradley was the only way to balance the scales. She insisted that Bradley, with his supposed brilliant entrepreneurial mind, was far better equipped to manage those assets anyway. She framed her vicious extortion as a valuable life lesson, a brutal but necessary correction for my lifelong insubordination. Thomas nodded vigorously in agreement from his own medical wheelchair. He quickly added that the local police were eagerly waiting for their telephone call, deliberately reminding me of the imminent legal threat currently hanging directly over my head. He proudly praised Bradley for his incredible magnanimity and kindness in accepting my catering business as adequate compensation for his severe emotional trauma. Bradley simply stood there, slowly smoothing his expensive silk tie, quietly soaking in all their misguided, pathetic worship. He looked down at me with absolute, unfiltered contempt and gestured impatiently toward the clear glass coffee table. He strictly commanded me to pick up the solid silver fountain pen and formally sign the transfer papers. The very final moment of their wicked, elaborate illusion had finally arrived tonight. Bradley stepped around the wheelchairs and approached the glass coffee table. He moved with the slow, exaggerated swagger of a predator who had fully cornered his prey. His polished leather shoes clicked sharply against the hardwood floor, echoing in the cavernous living room. He reached down and firmly pushed the thick stack of transfer agreements across the smooth glass surface. The crisp white pages slid to a halt directly in front of me. The bold black text clearly outlined the absolute surrender of my entire catering company, my commercial assets, and every single dollar of liquid capital I had earned through years of grueling labor. Bradley leaned forward, resting his hands on his knees. A deeply arrogant, smug grin stretched across his features, displaying pure, unadulterated triumph. He withdrew a solid silver fountain pen from his tailored suit. He held it out to me like a king offering a peasant redemption. He quietly urged me to do the right thing, whispering that signing my life away was the only logical choice. He insisted that once my signature was on the dotted line, this ugly ordeal would vanish, and our parents would call Detective Ramirez to make my criminal charges disappear. Catherine and Thomas watched the exchange with breathless, greedy anticipation from their medical wheelchairs. My mother leaned forward, her hands tightly gripping the plush cashmere blanket draped over her lap. Her eyes were locked onto the silver pen, vibrating with the desperate need to see my total financial ruin finalized. My father mirrored her eager posture, nodding his head in silent encouragement, his face flushed with the sick satisfaction of finally putting his disappointing daughter back in her proper place. They fully expected me to shatter into a million pieces. They expected me to weep, to beg for mercy one last time, or to scream at the sheer injustice of their vicious extortion. They were actively waiting for a spectacular emotional breakdown that would permanently validate their twisted narrative of my inherent instability. But I did not give them the satisfaction. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice or yell at them. I sat perfectly still on the edge of the velvet sofa, letting a freezing, absolute calm wash over my entire body. I looked at the heavy silver fountain pen hovering in Bradley's outstretched hand. I slowly reached out and took it from his grasp. His smug grin widened into a full, victorious smile, assuming I was finally surrendering to his blackmail. He stood up straight, crossing his arms over his chest, ready to watch me sign away everything I had ever built. I held the cold metal pen between my fingers, feeling its substantial weight. I looked down at the signature line on the fraudulent legal contract. Then, with deliberate, glacial slowness, I lowered my hand. I calmly set the silver pen down onto the glass coffee table. The soft, sharp clink of the metal hitting the glass severed the heavy tension in the room. Bradley's smile instantly faltered, his brow furrowed in sudden, sharp confusion. He opened his mouth to demand what I was doing, but I did not give him the chance to speak. I turned my attention away from the golden child and looked directly at my parents. They stared back at me, their eager anticipation rapidly morphing into uncomfortable apprehension. The air in the formal living room grew incredibly thick. Beside me, David remained perfectly silent, his posture completely relaxed, knowing that the microscopic wire taped to his chest was capturing every single second of this confrontation for the tactical police unit waiting outside. I slowly unclasped my leather handbag resting beside me on the sofa cushion. I reached my hand inside, searching for the specific device David had meticulously engineered for this exact moment. I pulled out a small, sleek smart remote. It was a custom override device David had programmed to hijack the local wireless network of my parents' home. I held the black plastic remote up in the air, letting the ambient light catch its smooth surface. Bradley took a tentative step backward, his eyes darting between the device in my hand and my chillingly composed face. Catherine demanded to know what I was doing, her voice pitching up with a sudden spike of genuine anxiety. Thomas gripped the armrests of his wheelchair, his knuckles turning stark white. I looked Bradley dead in the eye, stripping away every ounce of the terrified facade I had been projecting all evening. I let the absolute, unfiltered contempt I felt for him radiate from my voice. I spoke clearly and deliberately, ensuring the hidden microphone captured every single syllable of my declaration. Before I sign away my life to keep your golden boy out of prison, I want us to watch a quick home video. I pressed the primary activation button on the small smart remote without waiting for any further response from them. The device instantly sent a localized override signal through the entire living room network. Above the grand stone fireplace, the massive 85-inch smart television screen suddenly powered on. The bright, artificial glare illuminated the dark corners of the room, casting a stark light across the pale, terrified faces of my toxic family. The television completely bypassed the standard cable input and seamlessly synced directly to the highly secure feed David had carefully established from his cloud server. The screen flashed brilliant white for a fraction of a second before plunging into a deep, solid black, buffering the massive data file we had prepared. The silence in the room became absolutely, terrifyingly deafening. Bradley stared blankly at the dark screen, the warm color rapidly draining from his cheeks as a profound, suffocating terror took permanent root in his chest. He had no idea what was about to play, but the absolute icy certainty in my eyes told him his flawless illusion was already dead. The final checkmate against my family had begun tonight. The massive television screen flickered into sharp focus. The high-definition footage filled the living room with glaring light. On the screen was the exact room we were currently sitting in, recorded from the elevated angle of the fireplace mantel. The digital timestamp blinked in stark white numbers, displaying the exact date and time of the poisoning. Thomas and Catherine stared at the 85-inch display, their eyes widening in profound confusion. The video showed the two of them standing right in front of the sofa, their faces flushed with rage as they waved banking statements at my brother. Bradley was on the screen too, dropping to his knees and burying his face in his hands, playing the desperate victim. The live Bradley, standing right in front of me, let out a sharp, strangled gasp. His designer facade completely shattered. He stumbled backward, his polished leather shoes slipping against the hardwood floor. He realized instantly that the hidden nanny camera he thought he had deleted was currently broadcasting his ultimate crime. On the screen, the digital Bradley stood up and gestured toward the kitchen, offering to get a drink to calm the escalating argument. Bradley lunged forward, reaching frantically for the smart remote in my hand, but David seamlessly shifted his weight, blocking his path with an immovable stance. We all watched the television as the recorded Bradley reappeared, holding 2 crystal glasses filled with dark wine. He handed them to our parents with a deeply apologetic posture. Thomas and Catherine watched their digital selves take long, generous sips of the spiked beverages. The color rapidly drained from my mother's face as she sat in her medical wheelchair. My father gripped his armrests, his breathing becoming shallow as the horrific memory played out in front of him. They were watching the exact moment the industrial antifreeze entered their systems. The footage continued with merciless clarity. Less than 5 minutes after finishing the wine, the digital version of my father clutched his throat. He dropped his glass, shattering it against the floorboards. He collapsed onto his knees, his mouth opening in a silent, agonizing gasp for air. My mother rushed to help him, but the poison hit her system with equal, devastating ferocity. She stumbled backward, crashing into the glass coffee table before sliding onto the rug. They writhed on the floor, their bodies convulsing violently as the poison crystallized in their major organs. Thick, white foam began bubbling from their lips. In the present moment, Catherine let out a weak, horrified whimper. She covered her mouth, tears streaming down her pale cheeks as she witnessed her own brutal execution. But the most damning part of the video was yet to come. Through the horrific ordeal, the digital Bradley did not panic. He did not rush to the phone to call for an ambulance. He stood perfectly still in the living room, watching his parents choke on the industrial chemical he just fed them. The sheer, terrifying apathy on his face was broadcast in undeniable high definition. The real Thomas let out a choked sob from his wheelchair. On screen, my dying father reached a trembling hand up toward his son, begging for salvation. The recorded Bradley looked down at him with dead, empty eyes. Then, with casual indifference, Bradley stepped over his father's outstretched hand. He completely ignored their agonizing pleas for help. He walked toward the oil painting, swung it aside, and punched the numerical code into the hidden wall safe. He emptied the thick stacks of cash and expensive jewelry into his briefcase, zipped it shut, and walked out the front door, leaving them to die on the rug. The video abruptly ended, the massive screen fading back to solid black. The silence in the living room was absolutely suffocating. The horrific truth had just completely destroyed the wicked illusion my parents had built. Catherine was openly sobbing now, her frail body shaking beneath her cashmere blanket. Thomas stared at the dark television screen, his mouth hanging open in sheer, paralyzed shock. The son they worshipped, the golden child they protected at the cost of my freedom, callously stepped over their dying bodies to rob them blind. Bradley broke the heavy silence with a frantic, high-pitched scream. He pointed a shaking finger at the blank television, saliva flying from his lips. He yelled that the video was a complete fabrication. He screamed that it was a highly advanced deepfake, a malicious cyber trick David had cooked up to frame him. He wildly insisted that David used his cybersecurity skills to digitally alter the footage, begging our parents not to believe their lying eyes. Bradley fell to his knees beside my mother's wheelchair, grasping at her blanket, desperately spinning a pathetic web of denial. He swore he would never hurt them, insisting I was orchestrating this entire technological deception to steal the family estate. I did not let his pathetic manipulation last another second. I reached into my handbag and pulled out a thick manila folder containing the massive dossier David and I had compiled. I raised my arm and forcefully slammed the heavy stack of papers directly onto the glass coffee table. The sharp smack echoed like a gunshot, making my parents violently flinch. I glared down at Bradley, then shifted my piercing gaze to Thomas and Catherine. I told them to read the documents. I declared that the folder contained the absolute proof of Bradley's $3 million cryptocurrency debt. It held the brutal, violent threats from the offshore loan sharks demanding immediate payment. I pointed at the ledgers, stating it contained banking trails, proving he illegally drained their entire retirement accounts before the day he poisoned them. I leaned forward, locking eyes with my weeping mother and horrified father. I let all the rage, betrayal, and absolute disgust I felt pour into my voice. You framed your own daughter to protect a man who watched you choke on antifreeze for a quick payout. The words hung in the heavy air of the formal living room, echoing off the high ceilings and sinking deep into the bones of the two people who had thrown my life away. I stood tall, my shoulders pulled back, refusing to break eye contact with my mother as the absolute magnitude of her failure washed over her pale face. The silence shattered when Bradley finally comprehended that he was completely out of options. His frantic, desperate pleas to our parents abruptly ceased. The pathetic victim facade vanished instantly, replaced by the cornered rage of a narcissist who had just watched his fraudulent empire burn to ashes in front of his eyes. His gaze snapped away from the television screen and locked onto the small smart remote still resting in my hand, alongside the encrypted flash drive I had placed on top of the financial dossier. He calculated his last, desperate move. If he could destroy the physical drive, he mistakenly believed he could erase the nightmare and somehow talk his way out of the massive $3 million debt. A terrifying roar ripped from his throat. His polished leather shoes scrambled against the hardwood floor as he launched his entire body weight directly at me, his hands outstretched like claws, aiming straight for my throat and the evidence I held. I did not even have time to flinch or take a step backward. Before Bradley could close the short distance between us, David reacted with the lethal, lightning-fast precision of a man who had spent the last week vowing to protect his wife from monsters. My husband stepped squarely into Bradley's path, dropping his center of gravity and bracing his broad shoulders. As my brother hurled himself forward, David caught him mid-stride. He grabbed Bradley by the lapels of his expensive suit jacket, using my brother's own violent momentum against him. With a powerful fluid motion, David pivoted and drove Bradley forcefully backward. The impact was deafening. David slammed Bradley's rigid body directly into the heavy oak paneling of the living room wall. The antique picture frames rattled violently against the plaster, and a decorative vase wobbled dangerously on a nearby side table. Bradley let out a sharp gasp as the air was forcefully knocked out of his lungs. David pinned him there, pressing his forearm tightly against my brother's collarbone, completely immobilizing the golden child. Bradley struggled frantically, thrashing his legs and cursing, but David held him with an iron grip, his eyes burning with a cold fury that dared my brother to try and move another inch. Before Bradley could attempt to swing a desperate punch at my husband, the heavy oak doors leading to the adjacent formal dining room burst wide open. The sudden, explosive noise made my parents scream in pure, unadulterated terror from their medical wheelchairs. Detective Ramirez charged into the living room, his service weapon holstered, but his hand resting firmly on his utility belt. Directly behind him poured three heavily armed undercover tactical officers, their tactical vests clearly marked with bold white police lettering. They moved with coordinated, overwhelming force, instantly swarming the living room and establishing total control over the chaotic environment. They had been standing silently in the darkness of the dining room for the entire duration of the meeting. Thanks to the microscopic audio wire taped securely to David's chest, the police had heard every single word of the illegal extortion attempt. They heard my parents gladly offer to commit perjury and drop false murder charges in exchange for my catering company. They heard the entire trap snap shut. Ramirez barked a sharp, authoritative command, ordering David to step back. My husband instantly complied, releasing his iron grip and stepping protectively to my side, wrapping a strong arm around my waist. The three tactical officers moved in seamlessly, grabbing Bradley's arms and forcefully twisting them behind his back. The sharp, unmistakable sound of steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists echoed through the room, a poetic mirror to the exact sound I had endured in the hospital room just days prior. Bradley thrashed wildly against the officers, screaming that this was an illegal trap, shouting that he wanted his high-priced corporate lawyer, and demanding that Thomas and Catherine do something to stop this outrage. My parents sat absolutely paralyzed in their medical wheelchairs, their mouths hanging open in sheer, muted horror. They were forced to watch helplessly as their beloved, perfect son was physically subdued by law enforcement right in the middle of their upscale living room. Just as Ramirez began reciting the Miranda rights in a booming, unyielding voice, the heavy front door of the estate clicked open. The rhythmic sound of confident, measured footsteps echoed across the marble floor of the grand foyer. Nia walked slowly into the living room, her posture radiating an incredible, undeniable strength. She did not look at my parents. She did not look at me. Her dark, piercing eyes were locked entirely on the man she had married, the man currently struggling against the grip of 3 police officers. Bradley froze the second he saw his wife. A fleeting spark of pathetic hope flashed across his sweating face, perhaps thinking she had come to provide an alibi or stand by his side. Nia stopped walking when she was standing just a few feet away from him. She reached into her coat pocket, her expression as cold and unforgiving as a winter storm. She pulled her diamond wedding ring from her pocket. She opened her fingers. The ring dropped, hitting the hardwood floor with a sharp ping, rolling to a stop next to his polished leather shoes. Nia looked him dead in the eye. She coldly informed him that the police forensics unit had successfully executed a search warrant on his luxury SUV. They had confiscated the half-empty antifreeze jug. The forensic technicians had just pulled a flawless partial thumbprint belonging directly to him off the yellow warning label. The forensic technicians had just pulled a flawless partial thumbprint belonging directly to him off the bright yellow warning label on the bottle. Bradley stared at the diamond ring near his shoe. The absolute finality of Nia dropping that ring shattered his arrogant facade. He had lost everything. His freedom was completely gone. The massive debt to ruthless offshore loan sharks hung over his head, and he was going to a federal penitentiary. A primal scream ripped from his throat. He thrashed against the grip of the undercover officers, kicking his polished shoes against the hardwood floor to break free. He begged Thomas and Catherine to save him, screaming at them to use their wealth to buy him out. The tactical officers forcefully yanked Bradley upright and began dragging him toward the grand double doors. His frantic screams echoed off the vaulted ceilings as they hauled him out into the freezing night. The front door slammed behind them, cutting off his cries. The sudden silence in the formal living room was heavier than concrete. I stood next to David, watching the aftermath of my brother's arrest. Nia wrapped her heavy coat tightly around her shoulders and walked right out the back entrance to return to her young son. I turned my gaze back to the center of the room. Thomas and Catherine stared at the closed front door, trembling beneath their plush cashmere blankets. The arrogant smirks they wore just 20 minutes ago were gone, replaced by raw terror. They realized their pristine world had just been obliterated on a live police broadcast. The golden child they had sacrificed my life to protect was headed to a maximum security prison. Catherine was the first to break. A loud, hysterical sob tore from her chest. Her frail hands flew up to cover her face as she began weeping uncontrollably. Thomas immediately followed, his chest heaving as tears streamed down his pale cheeks. They looked completely broken, but I knew better than to feel a single ounce of pity for the monsters who raised me. They were not crying out of any genuine remorse for the horrific pain they had caused me over the years. They were crying because they had lost. Catherine leaned forward in her wheelchair, reaching out desperately toward me. Her voice cracked as she launched into her final attempt at manipulation. She sobbed my name, begging me to listen. She cried they were just so scared when they woke up in the intensive care unit. She claimed Bradley manipulated them, and they had no idea what they were doing when they pointed their fingers at me. Thomas chimed in, his raspy voice shaking. He pleaded they were only trying to protect the family name. He insisted the scandal of a son poisoning his parents would have ruined their social standing, and they panicked under the pressure. They shamelessly weaponized their fragile state, begging me to show them mercy. They pleaded with me to tell the detective it was all a terrible misunderstanding. I stood perfectly still, letting their hysterical pleas wash over me without absorbing their toxic guilt. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I looked down at them with absolute impenetrable ice in my eyes. I watched these two strangers desperately grasping for a lifeline they had intentionally burned to ashes. I took a very slow, deliberate step forward, closing the small distance between us to ensure they clearly heard every single syllable of my absolute final judgment. I spoke with a quiet, lethal clarity that cut straight through their pathetic sobbing. This family died the second you pointed your fingers at me in that hospital room. The heavy words struck them both like a brutal physical blow. Catherine let out a devastated gasp, and Thomas slumped backward into his wheelchair. Their manipulative hope was completely extinguished. I took a step back, sliding my hand into David's warm, supportive grasp. We had accomplished exactly what we set out to do. I turned my head slightly, nodding toward Detective Ramirez, who had remained standing silently near the archway of the formal dining room. The veteran detective stepped forward into the center of the living room. His heavy footsteps commanded absolute authority. He looked down at the two elderly people weeping in their wheelchairs, his face completely devoid of sympathy. Ramirez pulled a second pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his utility belt. The sharp metallic clinking sound made my parents freeze in sheer horror. Ramirez stated in an uncompromising voice that their false victim statements nearly sent an innocent woman to federal prison for the rest of her life. He informed Thomas and Catherine that their desperate attempts to cover up a violent crime to protect their social standing were highly illegal. Ramirez officially declared they were both under arrest. He listed the charges with clinical precision: perjury, obstruction of justice, and filing a false police report. He informed them that their medical condition would not spare them from facing the full wrath of the criminal justice system. They would be transported to a secure medical facility under heavy police guard until they were fit to stand trial. My mother let out a blood-curdling scream, thrashing wildly against the confines of her wheelchair. My father stared at the floor in mute, paralyzed defeat. The pristine reputation they had sacrificed my entire life to protect was completely destroyed. They were definitely going to be paraded through the local evening news as the wealthy, corrupt parents who shamelessly lied to the police to protect a murderer. I did not stay to watch the arresting officers read them their official Miranda rights. I did not look back as Catherine screamed my name, begging me to save her. I gently squeezed David's hand, turned my back on the burning wreckage of my childhood home, and walked out the front door into the crisp, freezing autumn night. 6 months have passed since that freezing autumn night when the heavy chains of my past were officially broken. The fallout from the police sting operation was swift, brutal, and entirely public. The local news cycle completely feasted on the scandalous story of the wealthy suburban family that tried to frame an innocent daughter for attempted murder. Bradley faced an insurmountable mountain of undeniable evidence. The police forensics unit matched his partial thumbprint on the industrial antifreeze jug with absolute certainty. David provided the encrypted network logs proving the massive cryptocurrency debts and the stolen retirement funds. The recovered nanny camera footage was the final, devastating blow. Facing a seemingly guaranteed life sentence for 2 counts of attempted murder, extortion, and elder abuse, his high-priced corporate defense attorney strongly advised him to surrender unconditionally. Bradley ultimately took a strict plea deal. He accepted 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. He traded his tailored designer suits and luxury leased vehicles for a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. The golden child was permanently locked inside a cold concrete cell. Even worse for him, the violent offshore loan sharks he owed $3 million to had a very long reach within the prison system. Federal lockup offered him absolutely no real sanctuary from the brutal debts he still possessed. He spends every single day looking over his shoulder in sheer terror. Thomas and Catherine faced an equally devastating and highly publicized reckoning. Their immediate arrest for perjury, federal extortion, and obstruction of justice triggered a massive legal and financial avalanche. They hired an aggressive, wildly expensive defense team to keep their frail bodies out of a jail cell, but the exorbitant legal fees rapidly drained whatever liquid assets Bradley had not already stolen. Without their primary retirement accounts, they were financially bleeding out at an astonishing rate. To make matters infinitely worse, the state aggressively pursued severe civil penalties for the massive waste of police and hospital resources during the fabricated investigation. The bank eventually foreclosed on their sprawling suburban estate. The antique furniture collections, the pristine hardwood floors, and the hidden wall safe were all seized by the state and auctioned off to settle their compounding debts. Their wealthy country club friends, terrified of being associated with such a grotesque public scandal, completely severed all ties. Their elite social circle vanished entirely overnight. Today, my parents live in a run-down, underfunded state-assisted living facility on the bleak industrial outskirts of the city. They share a cramped, linoleum-floored double room, entirely isolated and forgotten by the world. They have no visitors. They receive no phone calls. They have absolutely no money left. They only have the bitter, haunting memories of the golden child who manipulated and destroyed them. My life, on the other hand, experienced a profound and beautiful resurrection from the ashes of their betrayal. The very morning after the police sting operation, Detective Ramirez held a press conference and officially cleared my name of all suspicion. The city health department immediately reinstated my commercial kitchen licenses and issued a formal apology. The massive tech conglomerate that had initially signed my catering company read the true story in the morning newspapers. Instead of canceling our lucrative contract due to the controversy, their executive board publicly commended my strength and resilience. The intense media exposure surrounding my exoneration actually served as incredible, widespread publicity. Clients flooded our phone lines with new orders. My upscale catering and event planning company did not just recover from the shutdown. We expanded nationally. I recently opened 2 brand new commercial kitchens in neighboring states, hired 40 additional employees, and began catering exclusive celebrity galas. I did not build this new empire alone. David, whose brilliant cybersecurity skills and unwavering loyalty saved my life, remains my steadfast anchor. His actions proved exactly what a real, supportive family looks like. We also maintained a powerful, lifelong bond with Nia. She finalized her divorce from Bradley with absolute ruthless efficiency. She secured full sole legal custody of her young son and immediately changed his last name to completely erase any historical connection to my toxic family. A few months ago, David, Nia, and I decided to pool our resources and launch a specialized legal aid charity foundation. We dedicated the organization entirely to helping domestic scapegoats, falsely accused relatives, and victims of severe family gaslighting. We provide free, aggressive legal representation, expert cyber forensics, and extensive psychological counseling to innocent people trapped in the exact same nightmare I barely escaped. We help them find their hidden voices, gather undeniable evidence, and fight back against the toxic relatives trying to destroy their lives. Standing in my bustling commercial kitchen today, surrounded by a dedicated staff and the sweet, comforting aroma of fresh artisan pastries, I finally feel completely at peace. The journey was agonizing, but it forced me to recognize a fundamental, undeniable truth about human relationships. They say blood is thicker than water, but sometimes, blood is the very poison suffocating you. Cutting them off wasn't a tragedy, it was my survival. I had to let that toxic family burn to the ground so I could build a beautiful, authentic life from the ashes. Thank you for listening to my story today. Have you ever had to set firm boundaries or completely cut ties with toxic family members who tried to drag you down? I would absolutely love to read your experiences in the comments below. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you believe in standing up for the absolute truth, no matter how hard it gets. Remember, you never have to set yourself on fire just to keep toxic people warm. The harrowing story of Caroline serves as a brutal but necessary dismantling of the old adage that blood is thicker than water. Society often pressures us into believing that familial ties demand unconditional loyalty, endless forgiveness, and constant personal sacrifices. We are conditioned to endure disrespect simply because it comes from a relative. However, Caroline's nightmare with her brother and her enabling parents reveals a darker, undeniable truth. Sometimes the people who share our DNA are the very ones willing to destroy us. Her parents actively chose to frame her for a double homicide she did not commit, sacrificing her entire existence just to protect their deeply flawed golden child. This extreme betrayal highlights that toxicity, manipulation, and malice do not magically become acceptable just because you call someone family. The profound lesson here is the absolute necessity of establishing unbreakable boundaries and recognizing the power of a chosen family. Caroline did not find her salvation by continuing to seek her parents' elusive approval. She found it when she finally accepted exactly who they were, stopped fighting for their love, and stood up for her own life. She built a genuine support system with her husband David and her sister-in-law Nia. They became her real family, a unit bound not by biological obligation, but by mutual respect, unwavering protection, and truth. We must unlearn the toxic guilt that tethers us to abusive relatives. Your mental peace, safety, and future success are worth infinitely more than maintaining a harmful familial illusion. True loyalty must be earned through actions, not blindly inherited through bloodlines. Cutting ties with toxic people is not an act of cruelty, but rather the ultimate act of self-preservation. Please share your own experiences of breaking free from toxic family dynamics in the comments below so we can continue to support each other on the journey to healing.